Hello and welcome to Fresh Ears, the podcast where we get stuck into the wonderful world of podcasting from the viewpoint of brands and businesses. I'm Neil Cowling, the founder of Fresh Air, and you should know by now that we are the UK's leading podcast company for brands.
And I'm Michaela Hallam, the Director of Content. So Fresh Ears usually features a great guest who brings some knowledge or expertise to the world of brands and podcasts. And this episode is no exception, except for the fact that we're going to do it a little bit differently.
You can probably hear we're not in the studio. We're in our office in Talyard in King's Cross. And today we'll be joined by Dan Misener and Jonas Woost from data-driven podcast growth agency Bumper. They'll be delving into how the Bumper dashboard can help brands and businesses bring all their podcast data and insights together to make it all make sense, which is what we all want. The reason it's a bit different is because our Director of Marketing, Richard Blake, will be stepping in for me in that interview with Jonas and Dan alongside Michaela. You just can't talk insights and data stuff without including Rich.
That's very, very true. And as usual, we'll also ensure that you're up to date with all the latest happenings in the podcasting and audio space, as well as letting you know what podcasts you could be listening to with our podcast recommend.
So before all of that, let's get into Rich and Michaela's chat with Dan and Jonas from Bumper.
We will indeed talk to them, but first of all, a very warm welcome to Rich, the Director not only of Marketing, but of pressing send on the email.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for being my co-host for this interview with Bumper today, because as Neil just said, if it's about data, Rich is all over it. And also a very warm welcome to Dan Misener and Jonas Woost. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us. Glad to be here.
Fabulous. We're going to start with an easy question today. Although it's quite an open question. Tell us your Bumper story. Who are you and what do you do?
First of all, thanks again for having us. Bumper is a podcast growth agency. Okay, what does that mean? We basically help enterprise podcasters increase the reach of their shows. We help people get more listeners.
And what exactly do you mean by enterprise podcasting?
Right away, you're going for the big questions here.
Essentially,
we work with folks that do podcasting for a living. People where podcasting fits into their business model. And we have some clients that sort of make money with podcasters. We even have more clients that use podcasts as a marketing channel. That's a very, very big one for us. So it fits into the marketing mix. And, many of our clients are brands. They might have newsletters. They might have blogs. They might have videos. They might have podcasts. Podcasts and videos, of course, are sort of merging right now. So these kind of podcasters, many of the folks that we're speaking to, when we initially talk to them, they come to us and they say, like, we have a show or we're about to launch a show and we want to make sure we reach the right people. And maybe more than two. We want to reach a few more than that. And they come to us. And we help maybe six, maybe even more than that. And we help those podcasters come up with strategies and with plans on how they're going to increase the reach of their shows. And the idea overall is that there is no one-size-fits-all marketing plan for a podcast. Wouldn't it be nice if there was just a little checklist? Do these 10 things and your podcast is going to be huge. But obviously that doesn't exist. Every podcast needs their own individual customized growth plan,
and for the right
marketing plan.
reasons. I mean, that's our approach as well, is that you can't just do the cookie cutter approach because that's not going to work. It depends on your individual objectives, right?
Absolutely right. And not just your objectives, but it also depends on the creative and your ambition and the budget and the competitive sets. There's all these different pieces and you have to put it all together. You know what's funny? Like in our industry, in the podcast industry, it's kind of funny how we think like we can just like go down a list and be successful. I don't think in music anyone's thinking that. If we start a band, let's, all of us together, we can start a band right now. We're not going to think like, well, give us the 10 things, then we're going to be superstars. That just doesn't exist. Or same with movies as well, right? We were talking earlier before we started recording about new movies coming out. Marvel movies are not always successful and they're like really, really good at marketing and they have a huge brand and they don't always have a hit, right? So what did we think in podcasting that it's so easy to have one? It's really, really hard to make a show that wants to connect with audiences, but also then to be able to actually connect with audiences. So back to your original question, we help our clients figure that out.
That's absolutely fantastic. And I am an unashamed fanboy of Bumper. I think I would say I'm probably, in your top 10 of biggest fans. And I often use you guys as great examples of being able to kind of grow podcasts and things. So, but I want to go back in time a little bit. Like, when did you first meet?
Jonas and I actually have crossed paths a number of times, and we met a few different times before we started working together in a meaningful way. So I think, Jonas, you and I first met in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, at a conference that you had organized back when you were working mostly in the music industry. And so we met in passing there. And then over the next couple of years, we both found ourselves working for the Canadian public broadcaster, CBC. But we worked in different parts of the company and we didn't really overlap much. I think, Jonas, maybe we were on the same email a few times, but we didn't really work closely together. And so we met, but never really worked closely together or knew each other all that well until Jonas and I both met, maybe for the third or fourth time, working at a place called Pacific Content. And I know you had Steve Pratt on the show not so long ago, and both Steve and Jonas and I worked with a really, really great team at Pacific Content. And that's really where Jonas and I first started working closely together. Jonas, your focus was largely on sort of the business development side and the podcast strategy work. And my focus was on audience development. And we sort of built out the audience development department there. And it was at Pacific Content working exclusively with brands that we really started coming up with some of the ideas that I think were just the seeds of what Bumper has become.
So you said you met at Pacific and that was kind of exclusively brands. Now it's not exclusively brands. So from that kind of wider range of clients that you have, what is the most common question that they come to you with?
I mean, overall, the most common question is like, I want to grow my show. I want to grow the reach of the show. What's interesting for us right now is most people that come to us already have a show. That seems to be a more common use case. We made already a season or 2 or 3. And for our next season, we want to break through a plateau. We want to get to the next level. I mean, I don't know why that is, but I think like when you are making your first show ever and your first season, you kind of think everything's easy and you've got it all figured out. And I think more people then realize
second album that's the hardest bit.
That's it. They come to us for the second album, maybe sometimes the third album, which we love, by the way, because at that point, a bunch of stuff has been tried already. And we know we're going to talk about data. And what we love about working on shows that already exist is that there's past data. We can look at stuff. We can identify what worked, what didn't, what should we repeat. It actually makes our job a lot easier. It's not a blank slate. The most common question is, we have a show. We want it to be bigger than it is right now. What should we do?
And you talk about reach. You've mentioned reach a couple of times already. I suppose I want to challenge that a little bit. And I think that's something that I often will talk to a marketer about because they're so used to reach being the be all and end all. And often my point is, it's a podcast. You're listening on people's headphones. You have attention that is unrivaled in any other media channel. So why is reach your only metric? I'd love for you guys, and that's often been driven by some of the stuff that I've read about you guys. So I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit, and whether that's something that you have that kind of discussion with your clients and your teams a lot.
Reach is an important measure for a lot of our clients, but it's not the only measure that matters to our clients. And Jonas mentioned that we love working with teams on the second season, the third season, because there is some history, because things have been tried. Not just from the marketing standpoint, there is existing data around how effective an episode is in holding listeners' attention, which is much more a measure of, did we make an episode that is worth people's time? Did we make an episode that was structured and designed in such a way that people are going to spend a meaningful amount of time with it? Ideally, they're going to hit play and listen all or most of the way through. And so we tend to look at podcast success through a couple of different lenses. One of them is reach. How many people are we reaching? Sometimes people want reach for the sake of reach. They want the number to go up episode after episode, week after week, month after month, season after season. But often the clients we're working with are looking not for reach for the sake of reach. They are looking to get in front of and have people spend time with them from the greatest number of the right listeners, not just the greatest number of listeners, period. We work on shows that have hundreds of audience members, and that is a knockout success because they're trying to reach an audience that consists of hundreds of people around the world, and there aren't any more people in the audience target. There just aren't that many people in the world for some of these really specialized, narrow focus shows. If you're reaching 500 of the 600 people on planet Earth who could be listening to your show because you work in a specific industry or you're interested in a particular piece of technology, I think that's a wonderful success. We also work on shows that have larger goals, shows from media companies where reach is a really easy thing to translate into revenue, right? If you've got an ad-supported show and you are selling advertising on a cost per 1,000 impression basis, then yeah, we want as many people as possible. And yeah, we want the right people, but we're not going to say no to people who maybe aren't squarely in our target audience. And so reach is one of those measures, but we also look at things like time spent listening, what we call listen time or watch time, as a measure of editorial quality. We also look at things like downstream impact, right? We did a big project recently with a large cultural institution, right? The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. They don't have a problem getting people through the door. They really don't have a lot of trouble getting people through. If you're going to go to New York City, you might go to the Met, right? The goal of the podcast was not to get more people through the door. The goal of the podcast was impact on the audience that goes through that door and access for people who may never visit New York City and may never have direct firsthand experience with a visit to the Met, right? And so, I think we started off by talking about, increasing podcast reach. I think more broadly, we're interested in increasing podcast success. And sometimes that means total number of people. Sometimes that means greater impact. Sometimes that means revenue. Sometimes that means, certainly in the branded world, things like brand awareness, brand reputation, brand salience, right? So success is different for every single show that we work on. And I think the most important part is defining what success looks like from the jump so that you don't end up comparing yourself to some other show or some other network or some other brand that has an entirely different reason for making the show.
And so going back to that question of, okay, so a brand or a business or a creator will come to you and say, we want a podcast. There's not, again, one size fits all, as we've already discussed. So depending on your objectives, is there any single thing that you'd say that podcasts are good for? How should they fit into a brand or business's overall content strategy? What do they do really well that other things don't?
We always like to talk about the fact that if you want to reach as many people as possible today, tomorrow, next week, don't make a podcast. It's not what it's good at. It's not the right tool for that. If it's just about I want people to see my logo or hear the name of my company, no, don't make a podcast. It's not good for that. It is not really good reach medium. Podcast is still fairly niche. If you just want to reach a bunch of people, maybe social or search, right? Then there's other ways to do it. But if you want people to really deeply engage with you as a brand and actually spend time with you, real time, not just a minute, not just see the headline, not just see the tweet, but actually spend time and really get to know you, the brand, and really understand what your values are and what you're all about and I know it sounds strange, but what you feel like. Podcasts are amazing at that. I mean, where else do we have it that, people would voluntarily go to a financial institution, a bank, and spend half an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours with a bank? I don't even want to walk into my bank. I don't want to spend any time there. But I listen to some financial services podcasts because I want to, learn about the topic, and I really get to know what that organization stands for. We don't think there's another medium that can actually deliver that. If you really want to change people's minds about who you are, what you stand for, podcasts are amazing. If you just want to reach as many people as possible, I wouldn't bother.
We always say that no one listens to a podcast by mistake.
Or by accident, yeah.
Yeah, and that whole feel of just you are choosing to spend time with somebody rather than disrupting your day. which is most of how advertising is built, is all about disruption rather than about engagement, genuine engagement, rather than, hey, I'm watching my favourite show and suddenly I'm being shouted at about the latest Coca-Cola. Oh, sorry, maybe I shouldn't put a brand in there.
We're not the
shouting
BBC.
about the latest fizzy drink, then podcasting is for it. So my next question is, you guys, as I said, I'm quite a fan of you guys. What changes have you seen in the last few years in podcasting that you think will really drive podcasting in the next 2-3 years? Do you think, what are the kind of those big changes that you think are now playing out and are going to play out even further in the next couple of years?
Yeah, we always say that it kind of podcasting is just kind of growing up at the moment. So where's it headed?
One of the things I've noticed, and this is just one of many changes we've witnessed just over the past 2-3 years, is a much more expansive definition of what we mean when we say podcast.
Yes.
And I think the obvious thing to point to is, the rise of video and the emphasis that platforms have put on video. And I would be lying if I told you that I was anything but somebody who came up in radio. I came up in radio. I fell in love with audio and audio storytelling. I worked for many years in public radio and did a certain kind of work for a certain kind of audience in a certain kind of style. And my reference point for what podcasting was early on was effectively radio on demand or audio programs on demand.
Yeah.
And I think what we've seen in the past couple of years, and traditionalists, I think, bristle at this, is the reference point for younger and less tenured podcast listeners is not radio on demand. It's not an audio show that I can put in my pocket and conforms to my schedule rather than the radio schedule. For many people, podcast is a genre or a style of YouTube video.
They haven't grown up with speech radio in the same way that many of us have.
Yeah. And so there's all this hand-wringing about what counts as a podcast. Does it have to be audio? Does it have to be delivered through an RSS feed? Does it have to be consumed in a podcast app versus a more general purpose media consumption app? There's a lot of pedantic weirdos out there. I am one of them who really want to fight about what gets to count as a podcast. And to me, I think the people who get to decide what counts as a podcast are the people who are consuming podcasts. It is the listeners.
Yeah.
It is the viewers. It is the audience. And I have my biases and I have my own listening preferences, and I came up in audio and I still have a really strong pull towards audio storytelling. There are things you can do in audio that are difficult or impossible to do in other forms. But I think the numbers speak for themselves. And when you look at any of the survey data that has come through over the past couple of years, where they don't define what a podcast is, they're not prescriptive about what that word means. They let the survey participants define it for themselves. You can't argue with the fact that the growth in this medium, if we even want to call it a single medium, is coming from non-traditionalist platforms and non-traditionalist programs that would never fit on the radio.
Yeah, it's
would
this content.
Never fit on the radio.
And you have to put the
Yeah.
content where the audience is and where they are consuming that. Talking of platforms, what's your view on the latest Spotify for Creators launch? And what do you hope in this context of the future of podcasting is Spotify's next move?
We have access to an awful lot of our client shows and the data behind a lot of our client shows. And when you look at the growth that we've seen among our clients, the growth in terms of people and time spent, it is hard to argue that the growth is coming from traditionalist audio-only podcast platforms. We're seeing tremendous uptick in Spotify, tremendous uptick in YouTube, right? Apple is still there in the mix, And many of the smaller third-party audio-focused podcast apps are definitely still there in the mix, but we have not seen the kind of growth in audio-only platforms that we see in Spotify and we see in YouTube. I think Spotify's recent announcements, particularly the announcement about ad-free video consumption for Spotify premium listeners, which I believe is in 4 territories and only 4 territories, not global. I think that is incredibly interesting and potentially very disruptive to the status quo business model for ad-supported shows. We work with a number of companies that have ad-supported shows, and over the past couple of days, and I'm sure for the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a lot of conversations about the merits of publishing video to Spotify and turning off or adjusting the monetization strategy on Spotify. I also think about some of the shows that we work on that carry advertising, but not necessarily advertising for third parties. Networks that we work with who have house inventory. Networks that we work with who run ads for their own products or services inside their show. And I think there are a lot of questions about, say, a brand that does a video podcast and publishes it to Spotify. Are they going to be able to effectively run their own ads inside their own show in a dynamically inserted way versus a baked in kind of way? All of the reporting that I've seen coming out of Spotify, I think the status quo is under threat. Mm. And if you are used to a certain way of using your ad inventory on Spotify, an awful lot is going to look very different in 2025. And the details from Spotify are very thin. And all of the reporting that I have seen from people like Ashley Carman at Bloomberg, pretty light on details around the actual concrete next steps for creators, for advertisers. And so I think it's a bit early to say how it's all going to shake out. But this is going to blow up a lot of people's existing ways of selling.
Be the birth of new models, right? As a way of responding to this.
One would hope, yeah. and I imagine we're going to see a renewed interest in baked in much the same way that we see baked in advertisements in YouTube shows, right? I watch a lot of cooking YouTube. And in addition to the ads that I don't see because I pay for YouTube Premium, I watch a lot of home cooks and YouTube cooks who are constantly trying to sell me pots and pans and knives.
But what's exciting
I see those
about
ads,
that,
and I think we're going to see more of that baked in stuff.
Yeah, for me as a creative, the exciting thing about that is to create those baked in ads in a way that is content and not advertising, so that people aren't going to get sick of them. Yes, it's baked in, but it's an integral part of the content that I'm being served.
And I love what you're saying there, because from the listener's perspective, everything that's in the show is in the show.
Yeah.
Every component of the show, whether it's your music or your different segments or the ad breaks, it's all part of that listener or viewer's experience. And if what Spotify has announced ends up leading to the death or decline of crummy, interruptive radio style ads smack dab in the middle of a sentence on a video podcast, bring it on. I'm here for it as a listener and a viewer.
I am here for it too.
Yeah, me too. I think I'm fascinated by the fact that they're being very loose on the detail at the moment, probably because they don't know yet, but that kind of being paid for a length of time of listening is really interesting. We often say that, we aim for 30 minutes of a podcast length because mainly because we see the data and we see audiences start to drop off after half an hour. But it's starting to reward those kind of Joe Rogans and Stephen Bartlett's of this world who are kind of doing kind of hour-long plus episodes every day, because it's about the engagement and about the kind of length of time. Thank you. That's really, really useful. And I mean, the other thing I would want to say is it is very much a kind of Spotify trying to hit YouTube. They've seen the audience go to YouTube. They've seen that YouTube is fast catching them up on a podcast level, and how you negate those two big worlds. I think when I first started doing kind of working in podcasting, Spotify and Apple were the two major sort of palaces of podcasting, and they didn't really talk to each other. But YouTube is now become such an integral part of any podcasting strategy that you really need to think about how they all work and how the advertising model works on all of those things. It's going to be fascinating times. I want to tell you about my favourite graph of all time. And my favourite graph of all time is the
There's
time
a hot
spent.
competition for Richard's
No,
favourite
my favourite graph of all time
I have
is
to
the
say.
time spent graph on the Bumper dashboard. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Bumper dashboard is and why you think marketers need it and what sort of traction it's had so far? Tell us a bit more about it.
Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit here. And I think you asked a question earlier about what changes have we seen over the last couple of years since we launched. One of the things that was just for us as a company, which was a bit of an accident, actually a big accident, is that so we're a podcast marketing company, right? We help our clients be more successful in podcasting. Great. But in order to do that successfully, or at least in order to prove to our clients what's going on with their shows, we had to kind of do some measurement, right? Sort of, growth without measurement doesn't really exist or it doesn't work or you can't prove it. So we were always like, yeah, okay, well, we have to look at the numbers too, right? And as we were doing that, we realized, oh, wow, there's a bunch of tools. There are a bunch of tools that are not available. And there's a bunch of thinking that is actually in our industry that is, frankly, wrong. We have a lot of frameworks and approaches to podcast measurement that, in our opinion, are just wrong. So we had to completely accidentally become podcast measurement experts. We didn't want to do this. This is not the problem we tried to solve. We tried to solve the growth problem. Connect people with podcasts, connect the right people with podcasts. And sort of as a side hustle, we became sort of experts in measurement as well. And then when we opened that can of worms, we realized, oh my God, this is a huge mess. We identified that we want to make sure that our clients, not only in order to prove the success of their podcast, but also in order to be able to learn from everything they're doing all the time. Let's try a thing and then let's see if it works. And if it doesn't, and if it does work, then we're going to do that again. It's not rocket science, right? We haven't this sort of iterative approach. It's obviously been around for a very long time. But then we realized, the tools that we need, the measurement tools that we need in order to do that don't exist. So we built them. And then I would say it's largely Dan who built them from scratch, which is a huge pain in the butt because, as you can imagine, kind of a lot of work and quite expensive to do this. But we really felt we had to do this. So we, for many years, had sort of some internal tools that allowed us to measure certain things that were just not available anywhere else, or tools that aggregated data from a bunch of different places. And then about a year ago, maybe over a year ago, we realized, these tools that we use just internally, just us as a team, they were like hacks and there were sort of graphs that are being generated. We were like, I wonder if anyone else would like this. I wonder if this is like a thing that maybe our clients might want to just access themselves. So then we build what we're calling the Bumper dashboard, which is a place where our clients can log in and they can see the performance of their show. And they're going to see the numbers that are actually relevant to the performance of the show. Unlike certain other numbers, and I'm sure Rich, you're going to ask which numbers those are, that are not as relevant. And the Bumper dashboard does that. Our clients can log in and can see a bunch of data. Now, Rich, you were asking about one particular chart.
Yeah, I think critically, obviously, it's what the Bumper dashboard for me achieves is that, essentially before that, you're stitching together data from Apple Podcasts, Spotify for podcasters, Now Creators, YouTube Analytics, lots of different little places, which is essentially like taking 3 bits of homework and trying to make sense of them in 3 separate places. And so that kind of integration for me is really critical.
What you're touching on is exactly what we wanted to achieve. Right now, there are a number of places one should, most people don't do it, but should check out in order to see the performance of the show. Most people look at the podcast hosting provider. This is the place where you upload your MP3 files, your images and your text, and from the hosting provider gets distributed to all the listening platforms, including Apple and Spotify. That's where most people look because that's where you see this one number called the download. It seems like a good number. Everyone's talking about downloads, right? But we are always have been talking again since we launched the company about the fact that, the downloads don't really tell you who listened. It's just a file transfer. But we want to know people listening. And then to your point about time spent, for how long? How many people have actually hit play? And how long did they actually listen for? And you know what? Let's compare that between Apple and Spotify and YouTube. That's kind of interesting. So the Bumper Dashboard really is, as you described, a sort of data aggregation tool that pulls in data from a bunch of different places. Yeah, to save some time. Sure. That for a lot of people, that's just useful because it saves you time logging into all the different dashboards. But I mean, you could just log into the different dashboards individually. It's not that big of a deal. But what we have learned is that it's really hard to gain insights if you have 3 different dashboards, because you have to start squinting, right? You're like, okay, got 3 windows open. You see the graphs, like it goes up. Does it also go up there? No, maybe it doesn't. Oh, wait, it's a different time frame. Or this is something else. So it's not really just about the convenience. It's also about like, what are we learning? I don't care about the data if I'm not learning anything. And we were just, selfishly, we were unable to learn anything by logging to all these different dashboards because it's just the data just wasn't displayed exactly the same way. So the Bumper Dashboard solves that.
I agree. I mean, in the end, a number is a number, but actually what is more important is about the insight and the learning. And I think that's something that it really helps us to do. And I am fundamentally lazy. So being able to kind of see it in one easy screen is so much better.
I'd contest that, first of all. But also for most of our clients, that kind of proof of ROI is so important. And a lot of those insights go towards helping to make the case for that in the podcasting world. And so for those clients and for those people who might be listening who are kind of thinking, is podcasting for me? We've already answered that, I want to reach everyone and reach all the people. Maybe it's not. But for those people who are thinking, is podcasting the tool that's going to help me solve some kind of challenge? What would your top tips be for those people?
I would urge thoughtfulness and patience for somebody who is considering starting a show, relaunching a show, starting a network. What we have seen, having looked at the numbers for a lot of shows over a lot of years, is that growth in podcast audiences tends not to be overnight. It is slow, it is steady, it is incremental. It happens over time by earning people's trust and attention, earning a place in their habits, in their life. If what you need is directly measurable ROI 3 weeks from now, I think podcasting is largely incompatible with that sense of urgency. I ran some numbers a couple of months ago. I looked at the top shows in Apple's charts in America, the list of 200 or so shows across all categories. And yes, we know that that is not representative of the whole world, but it's a pretty good proxy for what's hot, what's zeitgeisty, what is getting followed and listened to recently. If you look at Apple's top charts in America and you look at the kinds of shows that are on that list, these are shows that on average have been in market for years. And they are shows that on average have hundreds of episodes in their back catalog. Overnight success is possible, and I'm sure people can write in and point to examples of overnight success, but it's rare. And so when I talk about patience and I talk about being thoughtful about it, I would advise people who are considering launching a show, getting into podcasting, to temper their expectations about overnight success, because this is something that happens slowly, steadily, and over time. One listener at a time, one viewer at a time, one follower at a time. And it's just incompatible with impatience. So I think that would be my big thing. And sort of related to that is, if you are a baby show that has 2 episodes in market or 5 episodes in market, resist the urge to compare yourself to other shows that have been doing it a lot longer, with a much larger team, with a much deeper back catalog, with maybe a very different business model, and likely very different reasons for doing the show. And I mean, I've been on the receiving end of this question a lot. Why aren't we as big as our competitors' show? And maybe there's a quality reason, and maybe there's a time in market reason, Maybe there's a budget reason. And maybe you're not as big as your competitor's show because they're making a show that you can't. What's the expression? Comparison is the death of joy, something like that. I would resist the urge to be impatient, and I would resist the urge to compare oneself to the nearest competitor, because they're probably not actually the competitor as seen by a listener or viewer.
It feels like the kind of ingredients for forming any kind of long-term relationship, be they human or in the podcasting world, are patience and focus on your own relationship, and don't compare yourself to others. And great points.
I've never heard the phrase comparison is the death of joy, but I'm going to use that again in my future life.
That might even be the title of this podcast. Thank you so much to both of you. Hugely insightful, hugely valuable conversation that I've really enjoyed. I really appreciate the time you spent with us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for stepping in, Rich. Hope you learned something meaningful, as in you, the listener, rather than Rich. I hope that was an insightful conversation. If you do want to talk about insights, growth and marketing of a podcast, either you have or you're considering, or using the podcast infrastructure and ecosystem to get your message across, Rich will happily help. That's what Fresh Air Media is all about. Right, time for some interesting audio-related stuff we've seen or heard that we think you should know about.
Yes, well, Rich is all about data, I'm all about creative, and I went to City University this week to the British Podcast Award Winners Talks, and it was kind of an audience of MA students. They are the first MA in podcasting at City University. It was really, really interesting. It was really, really brilliant. There were some great speakers, inspiring content, but in a kind of a reassuring way, it just reinforced all the things that we already know to be true, I think, to be honest. The common themes were the things that we know, but joyful to have them so brilliantly articulated, that podcasts and sounds reinforce intimacy. You can paint better pictures with words than you probably can with any sort of video, and you can really transport people with sounds. I loved the idea of places becoming main characters in stories that you're telling. There was a great talk from Jordan Dunbar, who was the producer and voice behind Blood on the Dance Floor, which won the Best Documentary Podcast. And he just made Belfast kind of a main character, and that was really strategic in how he told that story. And also how audio can be a really great space for hosts to become their most true selves, whether they're just starting out or whether they're and launching their podcast careers, which was the strategy, very much the strategy of the team behind Get Birding, who deliberately use a different upcoming host each time and help them kind of develop over the course of that story. Or people who are really established, like Victoria Derbyshire, and then came breast cancer, but kind of enabling us to see another side of them through the art of storytelling and podcasting.
I think that's really interesting because Victoria Derbyshire is at heart a radio broadcaster for like 20 years and an astonishing one at that. But it's still different, doing breakfast and drive on 5 Live is a very different thing, or Woman's Hour is a very different thing from doing a podcast, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And I think she was really candid about the fact that through podcasting, you can share a different part of yourself that you can't in other spaces. Yeah, and also that kind of ideal that whilst podcasts are all about niche topics, that doesn't mean that they can't be mainstream. There was Taqwa Sadiq, who was the producer behind Sacred Money. The series there is all about zakat, which is the Muslim tradition of giving 2.5% of your earnings back to community and home. And her kind of quest on that was around how that might potentially help solve the cost of living crisis. But the thought of, okay, zakat, Muslim tradition, it could be a really, really niche subject, but actually you use that as the jumping off point to talk about something that can apply to a much wider audience and help people think about things in a different way. It was really inspiring. So shout out to Brett Spencer. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Brett. We do love Brett. Also, he had me lecture on that course.
He did mention you, actually, in conversation about the fact that you'd contributed to that.
The students still talk about it, I think.
I think
highlight of the year.
Yeah, they had your picture up on the wall.
Did they? Yeah, whatever. Anyway, this is now time for our podcast recommend. It comes from Dan Misener from Bumper.
Hi, I'm Dan Misener, co-founder at Bumper, and my podcast recommend is Crash Course the Universe. It is hosted by Dr. Katie Mack, who is a theoretical astrophysicist, and it is all about the beginning and the end of the universe. And the reason that I really loved listening to this show is because it has really put a lot of things in perspective. Things that feel big are actually quite small on the scale of the universe. It's really contemplative. It's really lovely. And strangely, for a show about the end of the universe, quite poetic. It's called Crash Course the Universe.
Thank you, Dan. And that's about all for this episode of Fresh Ears. We hope you've enjoyed it and that it's been useful in some way. In fact, more useful because there's been less of me in it and more of Rich. Therefore, it's probably super useful. If you did like it, you probably love our weekly Fresh Air newsletter too. It was a special Christmas edition last week, even though it's still November. So do sign up on our LinkedIn page.
And freshair.audio is the place to go if you're interested in finding out how to potentially get started with your very own podcast. Check us out on our shiny new website. Thank you very much for listening.
Fresh Air.